morning, Susana. How are you?
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jamie. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've followed your work for a while. It's inspirational. So it's great to have the chance to have a proper conversation, albeit a remote
Thank you
one.
so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to hear.
And as we've talked briefly before the call, this series of conversations are focused on what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions. They also happen to be questions that I think most humans get wrong when they're answering.
hmm
And those questions really are about what's real and what to believe, epistemology, if you like, and what matters and who gets to count in our ethical deliberations. And I have an obvious bias, and the clue is in the name of this podcast and YouTube series, because I'm trying to popularize and develop a worldview, a very simple, basic, pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which simply says when it comes to thinking about what to believe, we should take a naturalistic approach based on evidence and reason, as opposed to maybe a supernatural or a revealed or a fideistic approach. And when it comes to what matters and who gets to count in our ethical systems, the clue again is in the name. We should grant moral consideration to all sentient beings, at least, any being that has the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing. So in a sentence, it's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who disagree and agree with that worldview. So it would be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now and answering those crazily big questions.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, but before we start that, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know you and your work?
Well, I am a philosopher of animal minds and also an animal ethicist. I have been a postdoc at the Messerli Research Institute in Vienna and also at the University of Graz. So I spent the last 5 years in Austria. But since September 2021, I'm based in Madrid at the Department of Logic, History, and Philosophy of Science of UNED, the National Distance Education University of Spain, which is also where I did my PhD. So I've kind of come back home. This is also my hometown. So it's really, really nice to be back. And I love my colleagues. If they're listening, I love you guys. I'm really happy to work with you. Yeah, and it's such a privilege to be back home. And so now I'm still working on the topics of animal minds and animal ethics, which is what interests me from a research perspective.
That's great. Yeah, it must be good to be back home. You still have family in Madrid, and
yeah, my parents are here, my brothers are here, lifelong friends, and it just feels really good to be back. I mean, some things I have to say are a little bit difficult after having lived in Vienna, especially for someone who cares about animals, because Vienna is a city that's very, very animal welfare minded, so to speak. So a lot of people have those concerns in mind, and it's very common to be either vegetarian or vegan. There are lots of options in restaurants. And all of my friends there, or most of my friends, either were vegan or vegetarian or ate very, very little meat. So it was kind of a different world. And coming back to Spain feels like going back in time in that regard. But it's also nice to not be a foreigner anymore, because that's always a little bit hard.
Yeah, you can comfortably settle back at home. But much work to do on the Spanish culture, as there are in most cultures around the world. Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. So this first big question we ask is, what's real, or how should we go about believing? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they originally grew up in quite a naturalistic, scientific sort of household and culture, or one that was maybe more supernatural or religious, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So it would be fascinating to know your story, and you can wind the clock back as far as you like.
Thank you. So in my case, I grew up in a household that was 100% atheist. And that's actually, it's very unusual for someone who was born in the 80s in Spain. So I'm not even baptized, and I'm one of the very few people my age from Spain who are not baptized.
Yeah, it's unusual.
So it's very unusual. And it was kind of funny growing up, because, I'd hear people talking about God, but my parents never talked about God. It just wasn't a thing. But of course, you hear about it. So as a kid, you kind of sort of incorporate that into your worldview. But because I didn't receive any explicit religious education, actually very funny because I used to think of God as a woman. I used to picture God as a woman in an apron who was sweeping the door of heaven. That's how I thought of God, which is super funny if you think about it. Like just a kid left to her own devices pictures God spontaneously as a woman. I actually find that quite fascinating.
Yeah.
And I remember I was only, the error was only brought to my attention one time because I just used the word she when referring to God, and my nanny was like, "Wait, no, God isn't a woman. What are you talking about?" So yeah, that's it. It just stuck in my memory because I remember feeling very, very embarrassed that I had gotten that wrong. When now I think it's actually very cool that I had got it wrong. But yeah, I never really like, even though I picture that, I never really had it as a belief, I guess. And in a way, I'm a little bit sad that I didn't receive any religious education, because it means that, I can't appreciate a lot of human culture as well as other people, because I just don't really have much religious knowledge.
Yeah.
So when I go to museums and stuff, it's good for me if I go with someone who does have this religious education, and they can maybe help me interpret some of the paintings and stuff, because I really know very, very little. Like I only learned the difference between the Old and the New Testament when I was doing my bachelor's degree in philosophy.
Really? Wow.
History of medieval philosophy. That's when I learned the difference. So yeah, it's weird, but so for me, it's kind of always been very natural to just not have God as part of the explanation. And my family has always been very science oriented. Yeah, and I guess that's how it has remained for me. Like it somehow feels very bizarre to me to have the idea of having those beliefs, simply because it's just never really been part of my worldview.
Yeah, it's unusual and pretty sort of clean. It just wasn't there. Did it ever feel uncomfortable or difficult, whether at school or in society more broadly, or was it just a sort of object of curiosity and it never really imposed itself on you?
There were some weird moments. I remember as a young kid, like being a little bit ashamed that in my family we didn't really believe in God, and like not wanting to say this out loud.
Is there something wrong with us?
Yeah. I don't know. It's just being a kid, like just very confused about the whole thing,
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's also doesn't really help that it's a bit of a taboo topic. So you couldn't really discuss it out loud, and yeah. But then I quickly grew sort of proud of my beliefs there. This also had to do with the fact that I went to a very posh private school, but my parents didn't have a lot of money. They had enough money to send us to the school, but we weren't rich. But the kids who went to the school really were rich. So they were kids from like very, very rich families in Spain. And so I always kind of felt the need to distinguish myself and rebel against just because I knew I was different. So I thought, I'd make that something good about myself. And so I think being an atheist, I also sort of incorporated into that, what made me different.
Yeah. It was a point of pride and something else that was distinctive and different about you and set you apart. Yeah. And it was interesting you didn't, there wasn't even any religious education at school either, because I'm not sure how the system works in Spain, but certainly in the UK and many other places, even if the state is secular, there's still, mandatory religious education of some sort. And obviously in some places, the default is very clear. There are many places in the UK where there's an obvious implication. This is the correct religion, but let's teach you about the others as well. And in other places, it is more neutral. It is just, look, this is a really sociologically interesting phenomenon that is important just because so many people believe in it. So we should understand it at least.
Yeah, my school actually was a British school. And so I did the British curriculum. I did GCSEs and so on. But it was also an international school. And I think for that reason, they kept it very secular. So I think we had a couple of courses where we did religion, but it was more like, different people in the class were assigned different religions, and then we had to make presentations about what those religions were about. But we didn't actually receive any explicitly religious education.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. And as you say, it's a strangely taboo topic. And that's one of the interesting things about these conversations, because in a sense, religion and non-human animal ethics to me are two of the really, really deeply important questions that there are powerful taboos and social norms about as well. But I agree, it's not the easiest topic to discuss. It's often so bound up with people's identity and sense of who they are, and it's such a deep set of questions and beliefs. It's difficult to address. But so there was no sort of religious theme running through your thinking, and as you said, you're sort of quite naturally scientific and naturalistically minded. Does that apply in every domain, or again, as you grew up and as you developed your thinking, have there been other areas, maybe non-religious, where you've been interested in the supernatural or the mystical? So many people will either start from an established religion and then leave that aside, but then find their way to sort of spiritual but non-religious or some other less structured formal belief. And some atheists find their way to that as well. They're like, it's not religion, but there's still something else about the supernatural or mystical that's drawing them.
It's funny that you asked that question. I'm trying to think of like who I am in that regard. I think, it's funny because my partner kind of makes fun of me at times, because even though I'm not religious, I do tend to be very superstitious. So I tend to believe in jinxes and things like that. Yeah, but it's kind of weird for me. It's I wouldn't call them like beliefs per se. It's more like, just in case. If you mention certain words, let's touch wood just in case.
So you don't really believe that if you step on the crack, something bad will happen, but
no,
you might as well not do it. Just
It's
I more a habit or a pattern, but
don't like tempting fate in that regard.
Okay.
But
I think we're still allowed to call you a naturalist, though. I don't think we have to be too strict.
So. Yeah. I think so. I think that's just kind of a quirk of my personality, but it's not really a set of beliefs.
It's pretty common. Yeah. Cool. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. And that answers that sort of first question about what's real and how to go about believing and how you do that. The second question, I think, is just as important, and it's arguably quite challenging for someone with a naturalistic belief. I don't think it is, but some people think it is, which is okay. Well, what matters? Ethics, morality, good, bad, right, and wrong. So some people with a supernatural worldview will challenge you and me and say, look, I have the Quran, I have the principles of the Bhagavad Gita, I have the Bible. There is an external deity out there who might move in mysterious ways, but at least there is some sort of external formal definition of good and bad and right and wrong. What do we have as atheists or as naturalists? So how have you come to think about ethics in a naturalistic context in terms of those concepts? How would you respond to that sort of challenge?
Yeah, it is definitely something that kind of worries me, and I don't have like clear answers. There are things I would say that I want to believe, like I want to believe in moral realism. I don't want to be a relativist of any sort, but I do think that ultimately I don't really have an argument more than some like it more comes from the will. Like I want to believe a choice. I want to believe that there are things that are objectively good or bad, and I think sentience is definitely something that provides a good grounding for ethics and for moral status. Because, it is part of the definition of sentience, that if you have sentience, you feel things as good or as bad. And that gives you kind of a good grounding. So I do feel the pull of that position a lot. And I'm definitely, I would say I agree with the spirit of it for sure. But I feel like something is left out. if we focus excessively on sentient, either as a criterion for moral status or as a criterion for moral or ethical treatment. But it's something that I haven't quite kind of completely figured out. I just know that there's something that sits uncomfortably with me. So one thing that I'm interested in, for instance, is whether we could possibly ground moral status in agency. Because agency also seems like something very powerful in a certain regard. Like there's something that ought to be respected about agency, I feel. And I'm not entirely sure. So there is a paper by Wilcox where he defends that sentience and agency are coextensive. So every being that's sentient is an agent and vice versa. I'm not certain that we can say that as of yet. And I would be interested in exploring the idea of whether we could ground moral status in agency purely, whether there is something to be respected there, regardless of whether the animal can feel something subjectively or not. But I haven't worked out the details of the argument, but it's definitely something that interests me. And also with regards to how we ought to treat animals, for my whole career, I've been very interested in the idea of harms beyond sentience. So ways of wronging animals that don't correlate with subjective feelings of suffering or negative feelings, So I'm interested in issues such as dignity or, harming animals in terms of preventing them from developing certain capacities or having certain relations. And I would say that I'm drawn to objectivist accounts of well-being more than I am to hedonist account. So I do think that pleasure is something important that you should have in a good life, but a life that contains only pleasure and doesn't contain a series of other goods, I think while it might be like a good enough life,
yeah,
it's somehow an impoverished life.
Yeah. Is it full? Is it flourishing? Is it? Yeah. Does it meet its potential, its capacities as well? Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Thank you. And because I'd love to drill into the moral status, the moral consideration question and those criteria, because I find it fascinating, how to work that out. I think it's one of the most important questions, because if you're morally excluded, anything goes, right? You're beyond help, right? Yeah. The basics have to be, you have to get some moral consideration, and then we can talk about how to work that through. So we'll come back to that. But the way you framed the first part of the conversation was interesting about, you're drawn to moral realism and you sort of feel a pull. You sort of want there to be an established foundation, but at the same time, intellectually, maybe you're sort of aware there isn't. And I'm very much an amateur in this space, so I'll probably use the terms in a sloppy way, and you as a proper philosopher can correct me. But I find that on the one hand, if the perspective is just that of the universe and physics, and the universe will ultimately end in a heat death, and it's just processes working, from that perspective, there is no ethics, there's no morality. That can feel quite nihilistic. Mm-hmm. And that's an approach some people take, which I think is a shame and can be dangerous. Isn't always dangerous, but it can be. I think many people who say they're technically nihilistic still end up finding a way to compassion and a more grounded ethic anyway. There's the other approach you mentioned, which I also would reject completely, which is this relativist approach, which is it's just the subject of normally just human interactions, and normally subject of powerful humans choosing, what the rules should be. And those rules are then by definition good, regardless of the harm or suffering they cause. I think that's crazy. I think the draw to relativism is often driven by quite generous motivations, because people want to recognize other points of view and other cultures and other ways of doing things. And I think that's appropriate and sensible. But when you get to the point where you're disregarding suffering and you're just thinking about compliance with a somewhat arbitrary set of culturally defined rules, again, that can lead to enormous suffering. So I don't want to go down that route either. at the same time, I don't think I'm not a moral realist in a sort of really pure sense, because I do think, ultimately it's just physics. There's no externally defined, set of rules or rationale or moral truths that could compel us. I think even if you were a moral objectivist and you found these moral truths, people would still say, yeah, but why should I care? And you'd be like, but they're perfect moral truths. I found them. And people would still say, yeah, but why? So I don't think, it would necessarily help that much. And I don't think they're out there. But as you said, that doesn't mean we don't have any grounding for ethics at all. And even if our ethics are, really just a choice, because people can choose to be immoral if they want to be, there is a rational grounding for that choice, which comes for me, and I think to a degree to you, down to the experiences of others. And it almost feels definitional to me that once we've set supernatural ethics and maybe a egoistic ethics to one side, morality almost by definition is some form of concern for others. And as soon as we're concerned for others, we're concerned for their perspective, how things go for them, the nature of their lives. And that's what leads me to sentience and maybe some of these wider concepts as well. So some people would say that's more moral anti-realism, because before sentient beings existed, there were no moral truths. So they're not objective in that sense. But others might say it's still a form of moral realism, because it is grounded in some naturalistic facts about what it is to be a sentient being. So I don't really know what's the philosophically best way of describing that, but it feels almost like a middle ground between moral realism and moral anti-realism that seems like it's naturalistically grounded for me. So that feels quite comfortable for me. I don't know what you think about that sort of balancing act.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, to a certain degree, I think we're on the same boat there, and I would agree with you. It's just that I'm kind of concerned that it feels that experiences aren't everything for different reasons. Firstly, because experiences, how you experience things, is subject to manipulation, right? It's subject to habituation, training, etc. And also because, well, there are just implications of the view of reducing everything to sentience that I'm very uncomfortable with. And I've seen several utilitarians defending, for instance, a solution to the suffering of farmed animals would be to genetically engineer them so that they cannot suffer or feel pain. And I find that deeply, deeply problematic view for many reasons. One of them is because I think, we are wronging farmed animals in ways that go beyond the suffering that we inflict on them, that have to do with the fact that we are oppressing them, that we are using them, exploiting them. And if we genetically engineer them to make them more compliant, to make them more docile, to, so that they don't really care what's going on, we're just worsening the oppression. That's not solving the problem. So it's only a solution to the problem if you conceptualize the problem purely in terms of suffering.
Yeah, because we might argue that we're reducing the suffering, but we're increasing the level of exploitation.
Yeah. And also, I think that, pain and suffering is bad, other things being equal, but they have important roles to play, and they are involved in other things that we do consider good.
That's why they evolved.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think I'm writing a paper right now on this with Zarigüeya for a volume that Chris Bouvier and Cheryl Abate are editing on new omnivorism. And Zarigüeya is an animal welfare scientist, and she's very interested in precisely, these kinds of questions, like the positive functions of negative mental states. So for instance, she works a lot on the topic of boredom and flow. So flow it's actually a positive mental state, but it is defined like the boundaries of flow are negative mental states. Let me just unpack this. The experience of of being in flow is the experience of when you're completely immersed in a task and sort of nothing else is on your mind. And you're just completely enjoying this, like the experience that some people get when they're running or they're playing an instrument or, having like just a great experience with someone. These moments of flow, in order to acquire flow, you need to move in the area between boredom and anxiety. So the idea is that you go into flow when your capacities are meet or are correspond rather to the challenges in front of you. So if the challenges are too big for your capacities, you're in anxiety. And if the challenges are too low for your capacities, you're in boredom. And flow is the region in between, right? But it kind of needs these other emotions to sort of emerge. It's like they form the boundaries of this. So this is just an example. Boredom is also said to have important functions because it triggers creativity and it triggers, it's sort of telling you, you need to find something stimulating. And this goes for other negative emotions, like fear is signaling that there's something potentially dangerous in the environment. Disgust is signaling something that could harm your body. So, it's not for nothing that we have these negative emotions. But I think that they are also involved in other things that we find to be of value. Like, for instance, in caring for others. Caring for others, at least in part, is constituted by being negatively affected by their plight. And an individual who cannot suffer is also a callous individual.
Yeah, because how can you feel empathy if you
exactly.
can't, echo that suffering yourself? Yeah,
exactly. So, and I think also with regards to, for instance, our relationships with others, I think that relationships, friendships, love are all part of a good life. And these are not necessarily net positive in terms of how they affect our emotional states. And also, I'm not sure that we even want them to be. Like, if your best friend moves to the other side of the world and you don't miss them and you don't feel sad about that, is that even a true friendship? So I'm kind of interested, in a sense, in sort of vindicating the importance of negative emotions, because I think that they're also important for a good life. And obviously, a life that's just constituted of negative emotions is a bad life. There's no question about that. But we don't have to think about it in terms of black or white. There's this whole gray scale in between, where I think negative emotions have something of value to give us, or they are part of things that we value.
Yeah. And I think there is a danger in just oversimplistic, flat thinking here, where you go, well, suffering is bad by definition, therefore let's erase it all. I'm like, well, you might want to think a little carefully about that, because I think you're right. These negative experiences evolved for certain reasons that have functions, and they form part of a richer, natural, flourishing life. That doesn't undermine the fact that sometimes the reason they are meaningful and even useful is because they are intrinsically a negative experience. They're still a negative, but you have to set them, I think, in that wider, richer context. But there's some interesting examples, because there are some people who think that you can maintain all that richness and wonder and still move ultimately to eradicating suffering. There's a very rare genetic mutation. I think one of the examples is a woman called, I think her name's Joanne Cooper, I sometimes forget, who has this mutation, and she reports experiencing no negative experiences at all. So one, she doesn't actually feel physical pain, which has some dangers to it, but she doesn't feel emotional pain either. But at the same time, she still has a rich, wonderfully connected, social and family life and so on. So there are some people who will, and I've interviewed, David Pearce is a philosopher who thinks along these lines about whether it might ultimately be possible to even adapt ourselves using technology or CRISPR or something else to move towards a position where we can, if not eradicate suffering, at least suppress it and put ourselves in a better state. But I totally agree. If we're oversimplistic and over-flattening, there's some real dangers there we should watch out for.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of this woman, and I think, I think we all kind of feel a little bit jealous when we read about her and how happy she is. But I think, that's I suspect that we are being sort of unfair to our negative emotions there, because I do think that they help us grow. They help us appreciate things, appreciate people. Yeah, and they help us be better people in a lot of cases. So yeah,
I think I'm with you in that. I think those negative experiences are just part of a rich, flourishing life. So we need to be, quite rounded and cautious about how we think about them, I think. So
yeah. And also like the possibility of, having people who are constantly happy. I mean, this was obviously the plot to Brave New World, right? Where they're all taking soma and feeling happy all the time. And they're an oppressed people who just don't have the capacity to rebel or to even realize their oppression. And that's also problematic. I think political participation is part of one of the goods that constitute a good life. And you need to feel indignation and resentment and anger and so on, and sadness, to also be moved to participate politically, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Now, and one of the things I've tried to do with this sentientism idea is, and it irritates some people because it just ends up so broad and so pluralistic, but I think that's important because the foundations, I think, are the most important thing. There's so many other details to work on. So when it comes to the sentiocentric compassion, in a sense, it's not necessarily saying only sentience matters, but it's saying that every sentient being should count in our moral consideration. So I tend to think of sentience in a really rich and broad way. So it's not just the sort of hedonistic pains and pleasures. It's, almost any positively valenced or any negatively valenced experience. So angst, love, a sense of community, a sense of connection. So I guess that's one approach, is to make sure we're thinking about those experiences in a really rich, broad way, not just pain and pleasure, which can seem quite narrow and restricted sometimes. But I think the other thing is, I'm suggesting we use it just to set our scope of moral consideration, but then it leaves the question open as to, how and what to value thereafter. So I'm also suggesting, it has an association with utilitarianism because of Peter Singer and other people who've talked about sentience as a, consequentialist outcome, if you like, good and bad results in our ethical calculations. But I also think it works under any other ethical system as well. So you can take a sort of Kantian or a deontological approach following someone like Christine Korsgaard, who says, look, it's not just humans who are ends in themselves, it's all sentient beings who are ends in themselves. Or you can take a feminist care ethic approach that talks about relations of care, as long as we accord that care to all sentient beings. You could take a rights approach, or you can take, there's a bunch of different philosophies I think you could apply. And the way I'm suggesting this sentientism worldview says is, you can use any ethical system you like, but you have to grant moral consideration to all of the sentient beings, and then let's work on the ethics. So, and I think that also leaves the door open for us to value things beyond sentience. So personally, I tend to, however hard I think, things do seem to draw back to this broad definition of sentience in some way. So in a way, the reason I'm against exploitation is because it causes suffering or it prevents flourishing. The reason I'm against restrictions on freedom or autonomy, for example, is not because I think of freedom as an end in itself. It's because I think that having our freedom restricted can restrict flourishing or cause suffering. So personally, because I've got a very broad sense of what sentience is, almost everything seems to funnel back to it. But that's not the way that every sentientist think. Many, as you say, well, sentience matters. That's how I set my moral scope. But then there are these other things that I also think matter independently of the experiences of the beings we care about as well. So some people will do that in the way you've described, where you might talk about exploitation or freedom, or autonomy, or agency. Others will even extend their moral scope further and go into sort of biocentrism or ecocentrism and say, non-sentient entities of various sorts should warrant moral consideration too. But in a sense, I'm more worried about making sure we get the right beings included than I am if we want to go beyond. It's almost like I want to set a baseline to say every sentient being counts at least, and then we can build on that platform.
No, I agree with you. And I don't mean to, I guess my feeling is kind of, I'm very convinced by that idea. And I sort of take it for granted. And maybe I'm being naive, but I sort of think like, who would deny that? Like, obviously, sentient beings count.
Sort of feels self-evident, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does to me, definitely. And for absolutely believe that it's a sufficient reason to be worthy of moral consideration. I have no doubts whatsoever. I'm just worried, like, I guess I'm sort of pushing against this trend that I see among my colleagues where utilitarianism is becoming very, very popular. And I think if I was in some other context, I would probably also be pushing the sentientist view as much. But I think I just don't do it because I feel like everyone grants that, everyone who's around me. Maybe I'm just hanging out with a certain type of person. So I'm interested in sort of challenging the boundaries of sentientism. That's interesting for me. But I would definitely agree with you on that particular point. It's of interest to me whether there could be beings that are not sentient but still worthy of respect. I'm interested, for instance, in the question of plant ethics, even though, I don't have an opinion on that. But I do know that, if you've had plants at home and I can see you have plants at home. Yeah. You see them grow.
I can't claim the credit for the orchids. This is my wife's genius. So.
You see them grow and you see how long it takes, and it just seems there is something wrong about just wantonly destroying them for no reason, right? Like, it seems disrespectful in some regard, and I do, I kind of have an interest in working out the details of that, and I'm also interested in, as I said, like, harms that have absolutely no impact on the specific experiences of animals. So when I was in Vienna, I taught a lot of animal ethics, and all my students had this sort of sentientist worldview. They come with that to class, and I was always kind of trying to challenge that. And one of the topics that we like to discuss in class was the issue of dignity. And there's a beautiful paper by Suzanne Cataldi, I don't know if you know it, where she just describes her impression going to see a bear circus show in Moscow. And she describes these bears who were dressed in like tutus and pushing like dog carts or whatever. And she writes like, it's probable that they underwent some negative reinforcement training. Maybe they're drugged, but what if they're not? What if they don't care? Or what if they're completely fine? Isn't there still something deeply disturbing about taking an animal who is so majestic, who would scare the hell out of us if we encountered it in a forest, and just dressing them up in this ridiculous way and making them like the object of our laughter? Like, there seems to be something wrong there. And it's not just about cultivating a bad character. I think we are wronging the animal. I think we are being disrespectful in a way that doesn't really have to correlate with a negative experience on his behalf.
Yeah. And I think in many situations where we're undermining or destroying the dignity of another, that goes along with causing them suffering and negative experience as well. I think they're nearly always quite tightly correlated. But if you put that to one side, is there a distinct wrong in the undermining of dignity? And I'm not sure. I do think it's interesting because I share that intuition, but I also wonder if that's the dignity thing is in our mind, not in there. So I wonder if it's more about us as humans than it is genuinely their perspective. But I share that intuition.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of part of the definition of this idea that it doesn't have to be in their perspective.
Okay. Yeah.
And I agree completely that it's very difficult to sort of work out the details of why this is bad. I think it has to do with the representation of individuals in a different way from what they really are, and their objectification. I just feel that there's something there that is important. And this also relates to the issue of wronging individuals after they have died. I do think that people and animals can also be wronged after they're already dead. So like literally after they are incapable of experiencing anything. I don't know if we just took, I mean, this is going to sound horrible, but let's imagine we take some homeless person who has died and just like sort of dress them up in clown clothes and hang them from a bridge or something. Isn't that like a deeply disturbing idea? And I think it's not just because people are going to see it and going to be disturbed by it. Like, even if no one were to pass that bridge, it's still like, I still think that we are disrespecting that person like deeply.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I share the intuition. You get into these sort of interesting thought experiments where nobody sees that happening. Mm-hmm. You'd also have to say that nobody actually did it either, because I think in a sense there's a sort of self-wronging through doing that act that is causing harm to you if you're the person who's doing it. I still struggle to come back to the fact that, you know, that being themselves is no longer a moral patient because they're no longer sentient. But regardless, I still share that strong intuition. And
right. But I think that, you know, like maybe it's not all about wronging moral patients. Like there might also be just, I think maybe virtue ethics has something to say here. Maybe it is about cultivating certain character traits, but there are just like things that ought to be respected. There is this wonderful paper by Fisher and Osterk that's called Facsimiles of Flesh. And I used to love to give this to my students in Vienna because they were always mind blown by this paper. So it starts off with this thought experiment where, you know, they start from, okay, let's imagine that there is a serial killer who has, you know, killed a bunch of people and has made objects out of their body parts. This is actually based on a true story. And let's imagine that there is a police officer who is in charge of the investigation, and the police officer arrives at this person's house, and there they encounter a lamp whose lampshade is made from the skin of a middle-aged woman. Yeah. And the police officer has kind of two simultaneous emotional reactions. On the one hand, he's horrified by the crime that this lamp represents, but at the same time, he really likes the lamp aesthetically. He thinks it's a really beautiful lamp. And so let's imagine that all of the possessions of this serial killer are destroyed, but the police officer can't stop thinking about this lamp. And so he decides to make himself a one that looks exactly the same, but it's not actually made of human skin. It just, but he does make it to very, very closely resemble the look and feel of, you know, the skin of a middle-aged woman if we make a lampshade out of it. And he just has it in his home. And like they put forward this thought experiment, and they're like, isn't there something disturbing about this guy's behavior? And they're trying to work out, well, what is it? Okay, maybe,
where's the victim?
Maybe there's negative consequences. Maybe, you know, visitors come and they're horrified, but let's assume that whenever visitors come, he hides the lamp. So there are no negative consequences in that regard. There's also no Kantian case against this because, you know, the materials he's making it from are not ends in themselves. No one is being used in that regard. But there still seems to be something disturbing. So they build a case based on virtue ethics. And what they argue is that he is showing a failure of respect. I can't recall the specific emotion that they talk about, but it's the idea of showing respect when respect is the right thing to feel. So they give analogies, like we've seen these pictures of people going to these Holocaust memorials and taking selfies. I used to post, these in my class. I would give them like these images of these selfies, or there was also a selfie of a woman just doing a duck face in front of her dead grandmother. So these are kind of like behaviors where you're not being sufficiently respectful.
Is there also something about not demonstrating the opprobrium that you should for an association with a negative act as well? So there's an expectation that you're supposed to feel negatively about the association with this awful thing. Why are you not complying with that?
Yeah, and they then extrapolate this case to the case of fake meat.
Yeah.
And it's very funny because whenever I teach this to my students, they always have a moment at the end where they're like, "Oh my God, then I can't eat my Impossible Burger," or whatever. And it's funny because the argument is really well done, and I think the conclusions are really compelling. Like there is something, I think, disrespectful about eating that meat, and they write at the end about how maybe it would, like, the vegan future world would be a better world if it were also not just plant-based but plant-inspired.
You break the association as well as breaking the suffering. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. So we share this sort of baseline recognition that all sentient beings should get moral consideration, but you're doing some fascinating stuff in challenging a sort of narrow sentientist approach that says only sentience matters and going much broader. And I'd like to come back to a couple of aspects of that later on as well. But one of the things that I'd love to understand the story of is you and I share this view that is just self-evidently true, right? If our morality is concerned for others and others have perspectives that do include suffering and flourishing, then of course we should accord them moral consideration. And it seems almost self-evident. It's almost built into the definition of morality, whichever, whether you use virtue ethics or any other system. How did you come to that view? Was that something you were brought up with, or how did you come to think about moral scope in terms of other humans and also non-humans? And
definitely not brought up in that. So I was a carnivore until pretty late in my life, and also I remember just not really caring about animals. So there is this story that I opened my book with, where I remember being a little kid, about 8 years old, and I got a microscope for Christmas. And I really wanted to use my microscope to look at an ant up close. But the ant had to be dead, because otherwise it would just be wriggling around and I wouldn't be able to look at it properly. And I remember coming up with this idea because I didn't want to squish the ant, because I wanted to look at the ant properly. So the microscope came with these little tubes that had a little cap on them, like sample tubes. I thought, I'm just going to grab an ant and have it in there until she runs out of oxygen. And then I'll be able to look at her without her being squished. I remember running this by my dad and him being totally fine. Sure, that's just an ant. Who cares? And I spent the whole day with a little sample tube in my pocket and waiting for the ant to die. And I remember it taking forever, hours and hours and hours, and the ant was still alive. And then I had this moment later in the evening where I just, all of a sudden, out of the blue, and as far as I can remember, with no external prompt, I just felt incredibly sad for the ant. I couldn't bear to think about what I was doing to her. All of a sudden, it seemed horrific.
Do you know where that came from, or did it just emerge?
It just emerged. Just suddenly, I guess I just somehow empathized spontaneously with the ant. And I just have this very incredibly vivid memory of going to this beautiful rose bush that there was in our garden and just, opening the little sample tube and letting the ant out and run free on one of the leaves, and just feeling like I had done the right thing, and even feeling a bit sad because the ant came out sort of like disoriented and dizzy or something. Yeah, and so that has stuck in my mind with incredible vividness, and I have no idea where it came from. It's funny also that my dad didn't express any reservations whatsoever about what I was doing, so clearly it didn't come from him. But yeah, I don't know, and I guess that's, if it's stuck in my mind, because it was somehow, I guess, foundational to my character in a certain way. And then I adopted a dog when I was 16. We gradually became super, super close. He died a couple of years ago, and I'm still not really over it, because he was really the love of my life. Like, yeah. I just adored him. Tate was his name, and I adored him. He adored me, and it was wonderful. And he was definitely the cause of my awakening, so to speak, because he really made me become interested in the animal mind and in the plight of animals. And I remember for a while still eating meat, but knowing that sooner or later I would have to stop. And I for a few years I used to say, like, as soon as I can't mentally separate what I'm eating from the animal, I know that. And I remember the moment when it happens. I was in London and I was just eating some rice with sausages, and at some point it just became utterly disgusting. And I couldn't do it any longer. So it was a gradual awakening. And of course, coming from Spain is just hard because we are a very carnivore culture, and there's obviously not a big culture of animal welfare or concern for animals in Spain and so on. But yeah, I blame my dog.
Yeah. And I get into conversations where people say, well, look, how can you be sure non-human animals are sentient, that they experience? And I'll talk about, well, there's 3 lines of inference. You can look at our evolutionary history and our adaptive context. You can think about their information processing architecture and analogs in our brains, anatomy. You can look at their behavior and communications and sort of analyze that to infer sentience. Or you could just look into the eyes of a puppy. There's a very direct, really simple way that will get you pretty much to the same conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that if you've lived with a dog, it's just very, very hard. I always say that, this paper by Donald Davidson where he denies that animals have minds. I always say that he clearly never had a dog, or if he did, he just didn't pay much attention to them. Because
I interviewed Mark Solms yesterday. I haven't published it yet. Who wrote an amazing book called The Hidden Spring, and he just thinks it's incontrovertible that non-human animals, very broadly distributed through the animal kingdom, all vertebrates and quite a few invertebrates, are clearly, have consciousness and sentience. But he said it's absolutely shocking how many people who are, even academics in the animal world, broadly defined, still seem to have this sort of Descartesian view that it's only humans and we're on some pedestal and non-human animals won't suffer. I find it absolutely amazing how people, even brilliant, even academic people who work in these fields, some of them can still deny that. It's very odd.
Yeah, it is odd. And I think, for me, it wasn't just about it being very clear that my dog was sentient, because I don't think I ever doubted that animals were sentient. But it was also like realizing that he was a little person. Like he had a very, very defined personality, and that was especially salient in my dog because he was a dachshund, and dachshunds are, they're such characters. I'm sure doesn't apply to all of them, but I think it's quite common that they're very, very stubborn and disobedient, and I just love that about them.
Just the character and the will and the.
Yeah, because this relates to this idea of mind, of harms beyond sentience. And I think there is something wrong in kind of training animals to be so docile and complacent and just trying please. And as much as I love border collies, they do make me a little bit nervous in their obsession with pleasing their owners. And I just loved about my dog that he never came when I called him. Never. Unless I had food in my hands.
We have Luna here, and she's very much the same. Very much the same.
Really?
Yeah.
What's her breed?
She's a mix. So she's a rescue, but we think a mix of Yorkshire Terrier, a bit of Maltese, bit of Jack Russell. We're not entirely sure, but she's absolutely awesome. But she's a force of nature in her own right. Yeah.
Right. My dog was the same. Like, he, like, for instance, when we took him out on a walk, if you tried to make him go up the side of the street that he didn't want to go up, there's no way. I mean, he was 12 kilos, but there was no way on this earth that you could make him walk in a direction he didn't want to walk in. Like, no way. Yeah. And I love that about him. And it just, for me, it's like, he's very clearly a person, and he has his own preferences and his personalities, his moods, everything. Yeah. It's there. And
that deserves respect. Yeah. And did you find because one of the other interesting parallels in these conversations is with many of my guests, they started out in a religious worldview and then moved to a naturalistic worldview. And for many people like me, it was quite simple, but for some it was extremely challenging, intellectually, emotionally, socially. A few of my guests, it even presented a direct physical risk to them making that transition, given the context they're in. And there's an interesting analog in this ethical space as well when we're thinking about non-human animal ethics and the transition to veganism as well. Often some people find that transition quite easy and the light goes on and they just do it. For other people, it's quite a difficult intellectual, emotional, social transition. Once you decided to make that switch, how difficult was that for you?
Oh, it's still difficult. So I had periods of veganism when I was in Vienna, but in Spain, it's difficult. I find it difficult to be a vegan, especially, in my home, it's relatively easy, even though the options in the supermarket are quite limited, but it's just very, very hard. Like, it's even hard to get vegetarian options in a lot of restaurants.
Wow.
A lot.
Even now.
So,
I forget because I'm so spoiled. I'm in London and some places around the world, it's so easy now. We have big corporations advertising veganism, essentially.
I know. That was the same in Vienna. In Vienna, it was ridiculously easy. Like, you would always have so many options everywhere. And here, I just get angry sometimes because when I go to a restaurant and I see that, the only thing I can eat are some, potatoes with chili sauce. That's all they can offer. I'm like, patatas bravas. I can't survive off that. Or they'll be like, oh, you want something vegan? Yeah, we can make you a salad. By salad, they mean lettuce with tomato.
Yeah.
Which is like there's no nutrition there. And they're still puzzled by the idea of, like, how can you make food without an animal in it? Even our vegetable sandwiches have tuna and egg in them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. It's a bit like the UK was maybe 20 years ago. It's an opportunity there. Hopefully that'll change fast. And we'll come back to that in a bit when we talk about the future, because I think things are shifting at very different paces in different ways around the world as well. But before we move off this, what matters and who matters question, I wanted to come back to your point about agency as well, because I find that a fascinating topic, because you were suggesting that agency maybe is another factor we should bear in mind that doesn't, that may be another layer on top of sentient beings who are also agents, but you can imagine, as you said, agents that aren't necessarily sentient as well. And maybe there's some value there. You hinted at that might have implications for how we think about non-sentient living things, plants, for example. It could also have implications for, I guess, artificial intelligence and, and robot intelligence. And I've had a couple of fascinating interviews with people like Josh Gellers and Roman Jan-Polsky and others who are thinking about AI and robot ethics as well, not just their threat to us, but our potential threat to them. So I do find that agency topic fascinating. So my predilection, again, draws everything back to sentience. I just somehow can't resist it. So if an entity's agency is frustrated, but they don't care or they don't experience anything negative, I struggle to see that as a problem. And I think you would still want to leave that door open. Whereas if an entity's agency is frustrated and they don't like that, the reason that's bad is because they're sentient. So that's one thing I think we would have a difference of nuance, or I'm still open to your way of thinking. I guess there's another challenge to this idea of agency. And I wrote again, somewhat amateur piece about what might happen to justice and our ethical systems. There's Luna. Hello, Luna, what's up? She clearly has agency as an autonomous sentient being. But what might happen to those concepts if we actually abandon the concepts of agency and even free will completely? And this is a bit of a tangential topic to what we normally talk about here. But I guess I'm a fairly sort of strict determinist in the way I think things work. So I think that the concept of free will is a useful, interesting concept, but I don't think it's grounded in any genuine independent freedom. I think ultimately we're all just physics. And some people don't like that idea because they want to hold onto an intuitive notion of free will. And I guess agency is closely related to that, this sense that we can do what we want. And other people are worried that if we lose those concepts, even if they're not grounded in reality, it might have damaging impact on our ethics, because if we don't have free will or agency, how can we hold people or other beings responsible? So I wrote a simple piece which said, let's put those concepts to one side. Let's imagine everything is completely deterministic. So there's no genuinely free will. And in a sense, an agent is just some other entity that is running physics. So in a sense, there's no real differentiation between an agent and a non-agent. There's an electron buzzing around an atom. There's a thermostat turning the heating on and off. There's a human being deciding to drink another cup of coffee. We just, and I came up with I guess, quite a reassuring answer, which is that ultimately, if we are still grounded in keeping our ethical systems and our justice system based on making the world a better place, and therefore a better place for all sentient beings, and therefore thinking about enhancing flourishing and reducing suffering, you might actually end up with a justice system that just drops retribution, but keeps all the potentially positive stuff in terms of deterrence and protection and rehabilitation and restoration and so on. So it was a bit of a thought experiment, really. But how do you think about that challenge to the idea of agency? Do you think it's something we can actually sort of well define and identify?
That's an incredibly difficult question. And I am not an expert on free will at all. So I'm very, very wary of saying something very silly here. I think that it's just difficult to answer, because even if it can be described as at the atomic level in those terms, I think you could also say that about sentience, right? You could also reduce it to physics. Yeah. I'm not sure how you can have one without the other, is, I guess, would be my point. If you are willing to accept a level of the level of explanation and at which sentience is a phenomenon, then maybe you also have to grant the level of explanation at which agency is a phenomenon as well, right?
I think that's a great answer, because in essence, I do feel the same way about sentience, in that I don't think there's anything magically different about what's going on in your brain and my brain and what's going on in my laptop or my mouse, or even in an electron spinning around an atom. I don't think there's anything fundamentally different there. I think it is all ultimately physics and information processing. But at the level of explanation, I do think that, using terms like agency and even free will and sentience, we can be realistic about their underpinnings. We don't have to pretend there's something fundamentally different about them. But I think they're still useful modes of description at a certain level of explanation. I think so. Yeah. Otherwise we just get to a point where we say, well, everything's just quarks and quantum fields, and okay, great, conversation's over. So that's a fair challenge. That's a fair pushback. I can't challenge the boundaries of agency too much unless I'm willing to give up sentience too. So let's keep both. Where to go next? So I think we've answered what's real. We've answered what matters, and that there is one more topic I wanted to cover in the sort of ethics section before we move on, if you've still got a bit of time left, which is another example of, I think, you challenging this notion of, is it just about suffering? Is it just about sentience? And this is your work on death and the significance of death to non-humans. And for me, this pops up in all sorts of different ways. One is, again, I don't want to be too harsh on utilitarians, because they don't all think this way, but there is a sort of strain within utilitarianism that's so focused on suffering, it almost sees death as an irrelevance. It's just an end of existence. So one, it says that once a being is dead, they're not a moral patient anymore. And two, if you could imagine a means of causing death which causes zero suffering to that entity and their family and group and everyone around them, then it's in a sense not wrong to kill, because it's not causing any suffering. And you can have the philosophical thought experiments around that, but I think that line of thought leads into some extremely dangerous places. And we'll see this particularly with the way many people think about animal farming, where they seem to have this illusion in their minds that, animals live short, happy, robust, flourishing lives, and then, painlessly killed, their group and family feel no distress at that. The animal loses nothing, and therefore animal farming can be humane. So there's this sort of thought experiment thinking about death, but then there's some, I think, really awful ways, oversimplistic presentations of non-human animal death plays through in practical decisions as well. And your work's been absolutely fascinating in, I think, one, helping us think more richly about what death means ethically, but also what how non-humans might conceive of death as well. So if you don't mind, it would be fascinating to sort of get a quick potted sort of sense of your work around death and how non-humans conceive of it.
Basically, what I've been arguing is that understanding death is a spectrum. So you can it admits of different degrees of complexity. And while the human concept of death is extremely complex and sophisticated, it's very far from the minimal things you need to understand in order to have a concept of death. So I argue that the minimal concept of death, which I basically defined as the idea of understanding that individuals don't do the things that they usually do, and that this is a permanent state or a non-reversible state, that's actually not very complex. It's not a very complex idea. It doesn't require very sophisticated cognition. And the cognition that it does require is quite widespread in nature. So we can expect the concept of death to be fairly common among non-human animals, is what I've argued. Now, people are always asking me about the implications that this has for killing animals. I'm working right now with Ethipite, and we're trying to translate this to an argument against killing animals. But the reason why I haven't really done it until now is because, for me, there were already very convincing accounts of why it's wrong to kill an animal that have nothing to do with their conception of death. And I'm quite convinced by the deprivation account of the harms of death. So the idea that when you're killing someone, you're depriving them of all future goods. And that for me is enough. I was convinced enough by that.
Yeah.
But I am also interested
that's at the core of why we think it's wrong to kill a human or a human baby that doesn't have an advanced concept of its own mortality is it's still wrong, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you do want to say that. So yes. But I'm also interested in a side of the debate that I feel has been neglected, which is the side of the so-called indirect harms of death. So these are usually kind of mentioned, but then set aside as uninteresting philosophically. So these are the ideas that, like the question of how the death of others harms you. Yeah. And usually these are set aside, like it's kind of granted that, animals might be harmed by the deaths of others, but philosophers have been interested in how death harms the animal that is actually killed. And as always, I've been trying to going against the current and just I'm always interested in what people take for granted or things that are set aside, because I guess I just like exploring new questions that haven't been explored that much. And so I'm interested in the indirect harms of death. And I'm interested in how understanding death changes how you experience the death of others. And I don't have answers on this yet. And I think there might be different ways in which this can affect you. Like understanding what has happened to an individual who has died can make it easier for you to overcome the death, or it might make it harder. And I'm not sure there yet. About that. But I am interested, for instance, in the question of whether animals have a right to grieve. Because we don't often give them the chance or the space to do this. So for instance, if you have two companion dogs, and one of them is sick and has to be euthanized, very often what happens is they're taken to the vet, and the other dog is not really given a chance to understand what has happened. And maybe we are wronging them there. Maybe they should be given a chance to see their dead companion and kind of come to grips with the situation. And we see this often also in the context of zoos. So one practice that is very common amongst social mammals, and especially among primate mothers, is the practice of deceased infant carrying. So grabbing onto their dead babies and not letting them go. And this is a practice that's very common, and it can go on for months. Some of these mothers just won't let go. And obviously, when this happens in the wild, it can happen for as long as the mother wants. But if it happens in a zoo, very often the zookeepers, they won't let this go on for as long as the mother wants, because it's disturbing to the human visitors. And I think that the mother is wrong there. Obviously, the monkey who's in a zoo is wrong for a lot of reasons. But one of the, one factor that we might have to take into account is this idea that the mother should be allowed to grieve how she wants and for as long as she wants. And they're not always given the space to do this. So yeah, I'm interested in these kind of other questions that haven't been talked about as much with regards to the ethics of killing animals.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating. Yeah. So we should probably come on to the final question, which again is another crazily big question to ask you with the time we have left. But it's about how can we make a better world? So another easy question. And it strikes me that, and part of the reason I'm doing this work is that almost every human-caused problem is either a failure of compassion, we are excluding some beings that can suffer, or it's a failure of epistemology. We might have compassion, but we've just understood things wrong. We've believed a fabrication, or we've been misled by warped evidence, or we've just made an error of some sort. So that's partly why I focus so hard on this sort of naturalistic epistemology and the sentiocentric compassion, is just to try and say, let's at least fix those two things as a baseline. And I think you and I share a naturalistic way of thinking, and I think we share that sort of sentiocentric baseline, at least, although you're working to sort of challenge and extend and build on that in fascinating ways. But most of the other humans on the planet disagree with us in some way, shape, or form. So most humans on the planet have some aspect of fideistic or supernatural or mystical belief. Some of those are harmless. Some of those cause harm and warp ethics. And when it comes to sentiocentric compassion, while most humans, I think, would sort of share an intuition that non-human animals matter too, in practical terms, they don't act in line with that. And you can see, animal farming as being the most egregious example of that, but arguably also our neglect of animals in the wild and the impact we have on animals in the wild too. So that's a long intro, but we're in this weird position where I think we hold stances that we think are almost self-evidently well-founded, but nearly everybody else disagrees. In that context, how do you feel about how we can make a better world? And that might be activism, that might be academia, it might be the role of your own work in philosophy and sort of trying to improve humans to make things better for all sentients. But how do you think about the future and how we might drive change?
So one of the things that I'm working towards, and I think is like a fundamental thing that needs to change, is that humans need to realize that they are animals.
Yeah.
I think that it's just something fundamental that, I have this book on my bedside table by Melanie Challenger that's called How to Be an Animal. And it starts off with a beautiful sentence that's something like, the world is dominated by an animal that doesn't know it's an animal, or doesn't think of itself as an animal.
It's a great line.
That is, it's great. It's so powerful. And I think that's just, something that we need to reconnect with our animal side, and that means reconnecting obviously with the natural world, and understanding that we are part of an ecosystem, that we are part of planet that we have to take care of. Also, maybe that way, lessening the importance of our human affairs. I think that's, something that's so important. I mean, so urgent to reconnect with the natural world.
Yeah, thank you. It's an important theme. Now, I'd share that stance. I think we're more likely to be able to improve human affairs if we understand our animal nature and the evolutionary basis for our good and bad ethics, and just the reality of what we are is going to help us be more realistic. But of course, I think that moral scope expansion to appreciate, all of the other animals is deeply important too. But that line of thinking can also go wrong, because there are some people who say, look, we are animals, I connect with our animal nature, we're part of nature, nature is good. Nature has cycles and systems and processes. We as humans should have the humility to play our part as an apex predator. And you can see where this is going, right? And it's the circle of life. And, we just happen to dominate, just as wild predators dominate wild prey. Yeah. And this is why this factory farm is completely natural and normal. And yes, I'll have my cheeseburger and a milkshake and a side of 2 fried eggs. So how do we avoid that sort of naturalistic fallacy while actually appreciating, our sort of reconnection with our animal nature and our role?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Because of obviously there is that threat, but it's also kind of cynical, because we don't necessarily have to leave aside our rationality and our capacity to reflect on our. I think that it's just very, very tragic that the world is in the state it's in because of an animal that knows what it's doing. So
I'm not sure. I'm to be honest, I'm not sure it's often held genuinely. I don't think the people who explain that view really model their morality on, wild predators.
Yeah, they probably don't, but I have definitely seen something of the sort used to defend meat eating, for instance. Yeah. It's just, we're just another predator. This is just how things are. And I think it's quite cynical to hold such a view. And I think it's also, neglecting the fact that yes, we are animals, but we are also very reflective animals, and animals that have the capacity for moral reasoning and moral judgment. And I think that it's sort of a false dichotomy to assume that if we acknowledge ourselves as animals, then it must mean that we get to behave in any way according to our animal instincts or whatever. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the case. I think that there is some middle ground, which consists of, acknowledging that we are part of the natural world and that we should respect the other species that we share this planet with, while also, acknowledging that we also come with these rational capacities that allow us to be very reflective and to think about the course of action that we're taking. And I think it's quite, I don't know, it's very disheartening to see that we are a species that is destroying this planet, and we know what is happening and we know what we need to do to stop it. And it is within our power, and we're not doing it. And it's just heartbreaking to see this. And I think it makes it all the worse, that we know this and we're not stopping it. So
we have no excuses.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think that, and I've written a little about this. I don't think that predation is necessarily amoral as it has been often constructed. I do think that there is, let's say, a certain moral hue to certain forms of predation, insofar as predators often enjoy the hunt and kill, and they have a certain degree of control over it. We see this, for instance, in house cats, right? I think a lot of people have seen house cats taking pleasure in torturing their prey. And I don't think that that's morally neutral, but I follow Mark Rowlands in acknowledging a distinction between moral subjects and moral agents. So a moral subject is a being who can behave on the basis of moral motivations, and a moral agent is one who additionally can be held morally responsible. And I don't think that these non-human predators can be held morally responsible, but they might still have motivations that are, immoral in character. But it becomes all the worse when you understand what you're doing, and you understand that what you're doing is wrong, and you're nevertheless doing it, right? So yeah, I think that we should acknowledge that we're animals, but also acknowledge that we're reflective animals and rational animals, and that this comes with big responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Given our capacities, it's right for us to have higher expectations of ourselves, and then we need to live up to them. And we have so much power, for good or ill. As you say, responsibility comes with that, or at least it should. And how does that leave you, just to close out, how does that leave you feeling generally about the future? Do you tend towards a more sort of optimistic cast of our potential for good or ameliorating the bad, or do you find that frustration?
Yeah. No, I'm super pessimistic.
Really?
I'm very pessimistic. Yeah. I've become more and more misanthropic as the years have gone by, and I just have zero faith in humanity, to be honest. Like, these are crucial years to tackle climate change, and instead we're involved in a stupid war, and it's just senseless. And I'm feeling quite hopeless, to be honest. And
well, it's a shame, but I think, just to give you some food for thought, I think you appearing on this YouTube video and this podcast will help us persuade the other 7.7 billion humans to become sentientists, and that will solve all of the world's problems. So it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time.
I wish. I mean, I do feel grateful for the fact that I can have a job where I feel that I'm contributing, my small grain of sand to trying to do good.
Yeah.
And that I'm not working for a big corporation that's polluting the air and so on. So I do feel very grateful for that. And
you're nudging human epistemology and ethics in the right direction, at least.
Yeah, you can. I mean, I'm trying.
Yeah. No, it's powerful work. Thank you. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation before we wrap up? Or, I mean, I think we've answered, what's real, what matters, and how to make the world better. So that's not bad in the time we had.
Yeah, no, it's. I think I've said all I could say on these topics, but it's been a fun conversation. Thank you.
It's been fascinating, and I think you challenge sentientism in some really powerful ways. But I'm still, I'd still like to claim you as a sentientist based on the basics of using evidence and reason, and at least having compassion for all sentient beings. Even though I think you trouble and challenge the over-reliance on sentience really brilliantly. So it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. Yeah. What's the best way of people following your work, reading your papers, buying your book, which is at the moment out in Spanish, I think, but others Spanish.
Coming. It's coming out in Italian. Hopefully there will be soon an English translation, and maybe other languages as well.
Schrödinger's Possum.
That's right. Yeah. I think the best way to keep up with what I'm up to is my Twitter account, because I'm always self-promoting there, because it's what's expected of academics these days.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that, and also on my website, I post all my new publications. I always archive them on Phil Papers, or either that or they're open access. And I also post all the press coverage that I'm getting. All the podcast interviews and everything is there. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, I'll include all those links in the show notes so people can connect and follow and keep up to date with your fascinating work. Yeah, I mean, compassionate work, deeply thoughtful, the best kind of philosophy. So yeah, it's been an honor to talk to you and add you to our guest list.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Take care.